If you've ever traveled up the Hudson River in New York, you've probably noticed the Kaatskill Mountains rising up to the west. They're the kind of mountains that seem almost magical. The colors shift with every change in weather every hour of the day. When the weather is fair, the mountains turn blue and purple against the evening sky. But when a storm is coming, they gather hoods of grey mist around their summits, like old men pulling on their nightcaps. At the foot of these mountains, there once sat a little village founded by Dutch settlers long ago. Some of the original houses were still standing, quaint little buildings made of yellow bricks brought all the way from Holland, with weathercocks spinning on their rooftops. In one of these old houses lived a simple, good-natured fellow named Rip Van Winkle. Now, Rip was the kind of man that everybody in the village loved. Well, almost everybody. He was a kind neighbor, always ready to help with anyone's work, except his own. The children adored him because he played with them for hours, teaching them to fly kites and telling them stories about ghosts and witches and Indians. The doves of the village never barked at Rip. They knew a friend when they saw one, and the village wives took his side in any argument because they all thought he was perfectly charming. But here's the thing about Rip. He had what you might call an allergy to useful work. He could sit on a wet rock all day fishing without catching a single thing and never complain once. He'd tramp through woods and swamps for hours hunting squirrels. He'd help any neighbor build a fence or husk corn, but when it came to his own farm, well, that was another story entirely. Rip always claimed it was hopeless to work his farm anyway. The fences always fell down, his cow always got into the cabbages, and the rain always seemed to start the moment he picked up a tool. His children ran around as wild and ragged as little wolves. His son, Rip Jr., was basically a miniature version of his father, right down to inheriting his dad's old, too big pants that he had to hold up with one hand. Now, Rip might have whistled his whole life away in perfect contentment, if not for one thing, his wife. Dame Van Winkle was what folks politely called a termagant, which is an old-fashioned way of saying she had a tongue that could strip paint off a barn door. Morning, noon, and night, she let Rip know exactly what she thought of his laziness. Rip had only one response to her lectures. He'd shrug his shoulders, shake his head, cast his eyes up to heaven, and say nothing. This, of course, only made her madder. When things got too hot inside, Rip would retreat to the only territory that truly belongs to a hen-pecked husband, the outside of the house. His only true companion at home was his dog Wolf, who was just as hen-pecked as his master. The moment Wolf walked into the house, his tail would droop and he'd slink around like a guilty prisoner. One wave of Dame Van Winkle's broomstick and he'd fly for the door. When driven from home, Rip would console himself at the village inn, sitting on a bench under a great tree with the other idle philosophers of the town. There, they'd spend lazy summer days gossiping, discussing the news from old newspapers, and doing absolutely nothing productive. The leader of this little club was Nicholas Vedder, the innkeeper, a man so still and quiet that the neighbors could tell time by how he moved to stay in the shade. He rarely spoke, but everyone understood his opinions by how he smoked his pipe. Angry puffs meant disapproval. Slow, peaceful clouds meant he approved. But even this sanctuary wasn't safe from Dame Van Winkle. She burst in on their peaceful gathering and scolded them all. Even the respected Nicholas Vedder himself wasn't safe from her sharp tongue. With nowhere left to go, poor Rip had only one escape. He'd grab his gun and wander off into the woods with Wolf. There, sitting at the foot of a tree, he'd share his meager lunch with his dog and pour out his troubles. Poor Wolf, Rip would say. Your mistress leads you a dog's life. But never fear, my friend. As long as I live, you'll always have someone to stand by you. And Wolf would wag his tail and look at his master with understanding eyes. One fine autumn day, Rip had wandered higher into the Catskills than usual, hunting squirrels. By late afternoon, he found himself on one of the highest peaks, tired and out of breath. He threw himself down on a grassy knoll and looked out over the view. Far below, the Hudson River gleamed like a silver ribbon, so still and majestic that you could see clouds reflected on its surface. On the other side, Rip looked down into a deep mountain glen, wild, lonely, and so dark that the setting sun barely reached its bottom. Evening was coming fast, and Rip realized with dread that he'd never make it home before dark. He sighed heavily, thinking about facing Dame Van Winkle. Being late for dinner was never a good idea in the Van Winkle household. Just as Rip was about to head down, he heard something strange. A voice echoed across the mountain. "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" He looked around but saw only a crow flapping across the empty sky. Must be hearing things, he thought, and turned to leave. Then the cry came again. "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" This time, Wolf bristled up, gave a low growl, and pressed close to his master's legs. Rip felt a chill run down his spine. Looking into the shadowy glen, he saw a strange figure slowly climbing up through the rocks, bent under the weight of something heavy on his back. As the stranger got closer, Rip was surprised by how odd he looked. He was a short, square-built old fellow with a thick bushy beard, dressed in clothes that nobody had worn for 100 years, like someone who had stepped out of an old Dutch painting. The old man carried a heavy keg on his shoulder that looked full of liquor. He made signs for Rip to come help him with the load. Now, Rip was a little nervous about this strange, silent man, but he'd never turned down a request for help in his life. So he took hold of the keg, and together they climbed up through a narrow, rocky gully. As they climbed, Rip heard strange sounds echoing from somewhere ahead, long rolling peals like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. There was no storm coming. Through a crack in the cliffs, they came to an incredible sight, a hollow in the mountain shaped like a natural amphitheater, surrounded by towering walls of rock. Trees grew along the top, blocking most of the sky and leaving just glimpses of the evening stars. And there, in the middle of this strange place, was the source of the thunder. A company of odd-looking men were playing at ninepins. Rip had never seen such a strange group in his life. They wore old-fashioned doublets and jerkins, had beards of every shape and size, and carried long knives in their belts like sailors from ancient times. Their leader appeared to be a stout old gentleman in a fancy laced doublet with red stockings and high-heeled shoes decorated with roses. He looked like a Dutch commander from one of those paintings Rip had seen in the village church. But here's what really struck Rip as odd. These men were playing a game, but nobody was having any fun. They kept the gravest faces, never spoke a word, and were the most melancholy party of pleasure Rip had ever witnessed. When Rip and his guide approached, the whole company stopped their game and stared at him. Their eyes were fixed and unblinking, their faces like stone statues, and poor Rip felt his knees knocked together. His guide opened the keg and poured the liquor into large flagons. Then he made signs for Rip to serve drinks to the company. Trembling with fear, Rip did as he was told, carrying drinks to the strange company. They drank in complete silence, then went back to their game. After a while, Rip's fear started to fade, and his natural curiosity, not to mention his natural thirst, got the better of him. When no one was looking, he snuck a taste from one of the flagons. It tasted like the finest Dutch gin he'd ever had. Being a naturally thirsty fellow, one taste led to another, and another, and another. His head began to swim, his eyes grew heavy, and the rumbling of the ninepins started to sound very far away. Before he knew it, he sank down onto the ground and fell into a deep, deep sleep. When Rip opened his eyes, he was lying on the same grassy knoll where he'd first spotted the old man. Bright morning sunlight streamed down on him. Birds sang in the trees, and an eagle circled overhead in a brilliant blue sky. Surely, Rip thought, I haven't slept here all night. He tried to remember what had happened. The strange man, the mountain hollow, the silent bowling party, and that wonderful drink. Oh, that drink, that wicked drink. What excuse was he going to make to Dame Van Winkle for staying out all night? He looked around for his gun, but instead of his clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found only a rusty old firelock lying beside him. The barrel was crusted with rust, the stock was worm-eaten, and the lock was falling off. Those mountain pranksters must have stolen my gun while I slept and left this worthless thing instead, Rip thought. And where was Wolf? Rip whistled and called, but only echoes answered him. Wolf was nowhere to be found. Rip decided to find that mountain hollow again and demand his gun and his dog back. But when he tried to retrace his steps, he found that everything had changed. The dry gully was now filled with a rushing mountain stream. Where the opening through the cliffs had been, there was now only a solid wall of rock with a waterfall tumbling over it into a deep, dark pool. Rip called for Wolf again, but only a flock of crows answered, cawing mockingly from a dead tree above. With no choice left, hungry and confused, he decided to head home and face whatever was waiting for him there. As he got closer to the village, Rip started meeting people on the road, but he didn't recognize a single one of them, and they all stared at him like he was the strangest thing they'd ever seen. And here's the strangest thing. Whenever they looked at him, they all stroked their chins. This happened so often that Rip found himself doing the same, and that's when he discovered his beard had grown a foot long. The village itself had changed too. It was larger now, with rows of houses he'd never seen before, and the familiar old buildings had vanished entirely. Strange names hung over strange doors. Strange faces looked out from strange windows. Rip began to wonder if he was going mad, or if the whole world had gone mad while he slept. A crowd of children began following him, hooting and pointing at his long grey beard. Dogs barked at him, and not a single one was a dog he knew. With difficulty, Rip found his way to his own house. But the home he found was a ruin. The roof had fallen in, the windows were shattered, and the doors hung off their hinges. A half-starved dog that looked something like Wolf skulked around the ruins. Rick called him by name, but the dog just snarled and ran away. "My very dog has forgotten me," Rip sighed. He stepped into the empty, echoing house and called for his wife and children, but only silence answered. Rip hurried to the village inn, his last hope for something familiar. But the cozy little inn was gone too, replaced by a large, shabby wooden building called the Union Hotel. The great elm tree that had shaded the old inn was gone. In its place stood a tall, bare pole with a strange flag, red, white, and blue with stars and stripes fluttering in the breeze. Even the picture on the inn sign looked different. It still had the same red face that Rip remembered, but the red coat had turned blue, and instead of a scepter, the figure now held a sword. The name underneath read, G. Neral, Washington. A crowd had gathered around the hotel, and they weren't the peaceful pipe-smoking philosophers Rip remembered. These people were busy, loud, and argumentative, shouting about things Rip had never heard of: elections, Congress, liberty, citizens' rights. Rip looked in vain for old Nicholas Vedder with his peaceful pipe, or the schoolmaster Van Bummel with his ancient newspaper. Instead, a skinny, angry-looking man was haranguing the crowd about heroes of 76 and Bunker Hill words that meant nothing to Rip. The crowd noticed the strange old man with his rusty gun and foot-long beard. An important-looking gentleman pushed through and demanded to know what brought him here with a gun on his shoulder and whether he was trying to start trouble. "I'm just a poor, quiet man," Rip pleaded, "a native of this village and a loyal subject of the king. God bless him." The crowd erupted in shouts. A Tory, a spy, a traitor. Rip was terrified. What had he said wrong? The man in the cocked hat demanded again. "Who are you? What do you want? Who are you looking for?" Rip asked about his old friends. "Where's Nicholas Vedder?" An old man in the crowd answered in a thin voice. "Nicholas Vedder? He's been dead and gone these 18 years. "What about Brum Dutcher?" Rip asked desperately. "Oh, he went off to the war and was killed at Stony Point or drowned, nobody's quite sure. He never came back." "And Van Bummel, the schoolmaster? He went to war too, became a militia general. He's in Congress now." Rip's heart sank. Everyone he knew was dead or gone, and nothing made sense anymore. In desperation, he cried out, "Does nobody here know Rip Van Winkle?" "Oh, Rip Van Winkle," several people exclaimed. "Sure, that's Rip Van Winkle right over there, leaning against the tree." Rip looked where they pointed and saw a perfect copy of himself, exactly as he looked the day he went up the mountain. The poor man was completely confused now. "I'm not myself," he cried. "I'm somebody else. That's me over there. No, that's somebody else wearing my shoes." The crowd began to tap their foreheads and whisper to each other. Clearly, this old man was out of his mind. Someone suggested they should take his gun before he hurt somebody. At that moment, a young woman pushed through the crowd to see what was happening. She had a baby in her arms, and when it started crying at the sight of the strange old man, she said, "Hush, little Rip, the old man won't hurt you." "Little Rip," the old man's voice trembled. "What is your name, good woman?" "Judith Gardner," she answered. "And your father's name?" "Ah, poor man." "His name was Rip Van Winkle. He went up into the mountains 20 years ago with his gun and his dog and never came back." "His dog came home alone," she continued, "and we never knew if he shot himself or was carried off by Indians. I was just a little girl when he left. Rip had one more question, and he barely dared to ask it. "Where's your mother?" "Oh, she died just a short time ago," Judith said. She burst a blood vessel in a fit of passion while yelling at a peddler. For just one moment, Rip felt something like relief, and he wasn't entirely proud of himself for it. Rip could contain himself no longer. He swept his daughter and grandchild into his arms. "I am your father!" he cried. Young Rip Van Winkle once. Old Rip Van Winkle now. Doesn't anyone remember poor Rip Van Winkle? An old woman tottered forward from the crowd, squinting hard at his face. "Sure enough," she said at last, "it is Rip Van Winkle. Welcome home, old neighbor. Where in the world have you been these 20 years? Rip told his story as best he could, though to him, the whole 20 years had felt like one night. The villagers stared and stroked their chins, not sure whether to believe him or not. But old Peter Vanderdonk, the most ancient man in the village and the great-grandson of a famous historian, had an explanation. He said that according to legend, the ghost of Henry Hudson, the explorer who discovered the Hudson River, returns to those mountains every 20 years with his old crew. His own father, Peter said, had once seen them in their old Dutch clothes, playing at ninepins in a hollow of the mountain, and he himself had heard, on quiet summer afternoons, the sound of their bowling echoing like thunder across the peaks. Rip Van Winkle had stumbled upon Henry Hudson's ghost crew and drunk their enchanted brew. He had slept through the entire American Revolution without knowing it. When he went to sleep, he had been a subject of King George III. When he woke up, he was a citizen of the United States of America. The village eventually accepted old Rip back into their midst. His daughter Judith took him home to live with her family. She had a good house and a kind husband, one of those children Rip had once told stories to. As for Rip's son, that lazy young man leaning against the tree, he was put to work on the family farm, but he showed every sign of inheriting his father's talent for avoiding useful labor. Old Rip soon found his place in the new world. Being too old for any kind of work, he went back to his old habit of sitting on benches and telling stories, and now he had the greatest story of all. At first, his tale varied a bit each time he told it. He had, after all, just woken up from 20 years of sleep. But eventually it settled into the story I've just told you, and every man, woman, and child in the village knew it by heart. Some people never quite believed him, of course. They whispered that old Rip had simply been out of his mind for 20 years, and maybe they were right. But the old Dutch families believed every word, and to this day, whenever thunder rumbles over the Catskills on a summer afternoon, they say that Hendrik Hudson and his crew are playing ninepins up in the mountains. Rip had slept through a revolution, missed his children growing up, and lost everyone he'd ever known. But in the end, he got exactly what he'd always wanted: freedom from Dame Van Winkle's scolding and permission to be as idle as he pleased. He became a village legend, the man who slept through history, and every henpecked husband who heard the story secretly wished for just one taste from Rip Van Winkle's magic flagon. And that, friends, is the true story of Rip Van Winkle, a man who wandered into the mountains, had a drink with ghosts, and woke up to find himself a stranger in his own life. Some say it's just a fairy tale, a bit of old folklore, but those mountains are still there, and the thunder still rolls across them on summer afternoons. So if you ever find yourself wandering in the Catskills and a strange little man offers you a drink from an ancient keg well, you might want to think twice before you accept. Unless, of course, you wouldn't mind sleeping through the next 20 years.